Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Seth Dellinger. I'm a member of the Feldenkrais Guild of North America's communications team, and I'm happy to be here with Faye Berton. And this is for the Senseability magazine this month of April 2023. And we're talking about the intersection or the relationship between yoga and the Feldenkrais method. And Faye is someone who really embodies this relationship. She's been teaching for nearly 30 years, mainly in the Twin Cities area in Minnesota, but also she's taught in Canada and Mexico. She is the author of two books called Fluid Strength Yoga and Embodied Ayurveda for Yoga Practitioners. And first of all, just welcome, Faye. Glad to have you with us. Is there anything else you'd want to add on your bio there, just to fill people in on who you are?
No, except that yoga and Feldenkrais have literally been my career.
Yeah.
When I first started teaching yoga, I had a horrible shoulder injury that nobody could figure out, and finally an osteopath said, you need to do Feldenkrais. So that was very early on in teaching. So as I learned Feldenkrais, it developed right into my teaching of yoga. So back and forth my entire teaching career.
Yeah, it caught my eye on your website that you said yoga and Feldenkrais for me are inextricably woven. So love to hear more about that. But maybe just to begin with, as we know, in general out there in the world, more people are familiar with yoga than they are with the Feldenkrais method. They're both different ways of working through the body to, I would say, do much more than improve movement. It's really about improving the human being. But I wonder how you would maybe describe, and of course, as you mentioned before, there's so many forms of yoga, so we're speaking a little generally. But what would you say about each of these two forms of learning, just to kind of start us off here?
Do you mean what are the differences between them, or?
Well, even just like, what's your thumbnail sketch? What is yoga?
Oh, well, for me, and I love, if I can digress for just one sentence, I like the phrase that Feldenkrais used, that Feldenkrais, in working with Feldenkrais, you need to develop your own handwriting. So for every Feldenkrais practitioner, there's a different focus, there's a different piece of it, because the system is so beautifully huge. For me, with yoga and Feldenkrais, they're both about awareness. Feldenkrais is has more, I don't know if this is quite exactly true, but Feldenkrais is about cultivating options, broadening options, looking at things differently, finding different ways to move, finding different ways to think. Yoga is about awareness, but it's more about refining oneself within form. And Feldenkrais is about refining one's awareness in differentiated movements.
So I'm just imagining, as I listen to you, for someone like yourself who has been so deeply immersed in both, there can be a dialogue between working within form and then creating different options. If someone listening is very familiar with yoga, or at least with the yoga asana practice, because I know that yoga has much more to it than what we typically think of in the West when we think of a yoga class. But let's just say that's the starting point, and the person has never experienced the Feldenkrais method. If they were to go to an awareness through movement class, which is how Feldenkrais is taught to groups, what might open up for them in their experience generally, but also when they went back to their next yoga class? What might Feldenkrais add to their experience?
Oh boy, there's lots. One of the things that particularly interests me is how Feldenkrais explores movement both from the periphery and from the center.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the moving of the body by reaching arms into space, reaching legs into space. And then also centrally, whereas the arm is expresses movement by moving the torso and then letting the arm unfold from that. So somebody coming to a Feldenkrais class and going back to yoga, if they're doing standing poses, which are extensions of the arms and legs, they might find different experiences of the pose by exploring the different ways that their arms can reach into space, like elongating through each individual finger creates a different line and impacts the pose differently, and a version of that through the feet. They could also become aware, depending on the kind of yoga, become aware of muscles in the deep back to explore the reach of the arms. They could even explore organs as a place to reach from. So anything in the center can be a place where movement can express out from. Mm-hmm. So there's the from the center outward, and then from the peripheral reaching outward, and then from the peripheral coming inward. So the sense of wholeness, if that would be a way to say it, might be something that somebody coming to a Feldenkrais class might take back to an asana class.
As I mentioned to you, I personally have just this much experience with yoga. I'm not too knowledgeable, but one kind of really basic thing by going to yoga classes and my experience of the Feldenkrais method would be, when I go to a yoga class, I might do 12 or 15 different positions in the course of an hour. Whereas in a Feldenkrais class, and this is not true 100% of the time, but often it's like I am doing one movement for the whole hour. I keep coming back at it in different ways. I might even sometimes do it lying on the back, other times lying on the side. But there's a sense it's almost like a study, like an internal exploration of something. And so someone listening might get that we're also talking about two different paces of approaching the movement. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of, like, how are we learning movement when we do yoga? How are we learning movement when we are practicing the Feldenkrais method?
Well, I mean, as you described, one of the things that I always love to tell my students around the awareness through movement is it rolls very easily off the tongue, but it really is awareness through movement. So a Feldenkrais process is about developing awareness, about using movement to develop awareness. That can translate back into yoga, because yoga is about awareness. Depending on the style, it's a very, very different kind of awareness. In a meditative asana practice, there's meditative vinyasas where there's slow moving, and the awareness is there. But the awareness is sort of channeled in this form. Whereas if you take a faster vinyasa, that awareness is going to be very different than if it's a meditative. So the slowness that you describe in awareness through movement is going to be easier to translate into a meditative form of asana. It's going to be interesting because it's absolutely very, very applicable to take the awareness through movement understanding into, like, the structure of Iyengar, or the aerobic asana of somebody like Pattabhi Jois. One of the my favorite sort of, if you want to call it, Feldenkrais principles is recognizing that we all carry effort that we are not aware of.
Mm.
So whatever style of yoga we're doing, if we take that idea of, I can assume that I'm using more effort than I need.
Mm-hmm.
I can't feel it. So there's there's the thing of, is I have to assume that the slowness and the coming back to the awareness through movement focus can help us to become aware of how we carry extra tension, how to use less effort, what happens when our awareness keeps coming back to the same idea with the Feldenkrais idea of reducing effort. And that is applicable literally to every style of asana practice, no matter what. It can be very vigorous and muscular, it can be structural, it can be meditative, but every one of those people is using their own body. And if they go into it with the idea that I can't feel it, but I know that I'm using more effort than I need, and I'm going to invite myself to whatever I'm doing to use less effort.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that it was pretty early on for you in your practice of yoga that you already encountered the Feldenkrais method, but I'm wondering if you remember, kind of the before after, like did your understanding or your approach or your experience of yoga really shift after you began to be involved with the Feldenkrais method?
Ooh, wow. I came to Feldenkrais because I had a severe shoulder injury in yoga.
Mm.
And after working with an osteopath for 2 years, he said, I can't figure this out. You need to go do Feldenkrais.
Mm.
So I started doing Feldenkrais, and my practice at that time was Iyengar, which is a very strong form.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that my shoulder didn't work. I trusted my osteopath to do it, because when I first started doing Feldenkrais, I thought, I have no idea what's going on.
Mm.
And to ask me to keep reducing my effort to make the movement smaller, it just short-circuited my brain after studying all of that Iyengar. Mm. But I was highly, highly motivated. So I just kept going. And I actually, this was a lovely thing for me. I was, at that point, it was a long time ago, I was using the audio of, oh gosh, what was his name? The guy that wrote, he was a Feldenkrais practitioner, and he talked about the red light, green light. What was his name?
Mm. Not sure, but you found some recorded awareness through movement, sounds like.
Yeah. And I was able to call him, and I was so confused. Mm-hmm. And when I talked to him, this smiling voice on the other side said, sounds like you're doing pretty well. So that idea of not knowing, yoga tends to want to know. Feldenkrais is comfortable living in that not knowing space, because out of that not knowing space, new and surprising potentials can come. So I had that support, and I just went through it, and then gradually the whole process of Feldenkrais just opened up for me. In just such a beautiful way. But it was not easy for me. Partly, I think, because of my training, partly because of I probably carried lots and lots of tension and effort.
Yeah, I'd be interested to explore that a little further. You said there's a sense of, in yoga, like wanting to kind of to really know. And then I'm hearing you describe, like, for what did you say, your brain meltdown when doing Feldenkrais, like what often can happen when we practice awareness through movement is we're asked to do something, we really realize we don't know how to do it. And yet there's a space there to just be in the confusion. Like we're encouraged not to sort of slap ourselves on the wrist or think, oh, I'm a screw up because I can't do this. And so I'm curious about that because, for asana practice, like if we go online and we look up a yoga pose because we want to do it right, we will find a lot of explanations about the right way to do it. Do this, do this, do this. And of course, a lot of those, guidelines are probably helpful. If you want to be in that position, you're going to need to feel certain parts of your body doing different things. There's probably a particular place that you really need to hold your attention for that pose. But it's got a little more baked into it, the sense of a right versus wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Feldenkrais has this exploratory. So, but you didn't drop yoga. You teach yoga to this day. So were you able to bring in some of that more open-ended curiosity into your yoga teaching through Feldenkrais?
Yes, completely. I mean, that is actually one of the focuses in how I teach. And, in one of my yoga classes, there's this wonderful example that a student of mine who locked herself out of her house. And the only thing that was open was this kitchen window that was high up. It came in over the sink, and it was not open very wide. So she got this ladder and she just looked at it and she said, okay, I'll try moving through with my shoulder and see if I can get in there. And I don't remember everything that she did, but she just explored all of the options for being able to move herself through that window in this small space, and was able to do it. Mm-hmm. And she brought that to class and said it was the exploratory nature of the yoga practice that we do that allowed her to be able to think, and I love that. I remember in my Feldenkrais training, I don't know if this is common in all Feldenkrais trainings or was idiosyncratic to ours, this phrase called flinking. It's feeling and thinking put together through the body. So we learn how to think through our body. So you think combined with feeling as you explore Feldenkrais movements, which that is definitely translatable to any form of asana practice. And again, depending on the kind of asana practice, it will take a little bit of a different form.
What about, and this is a question again about the two different ways of learning. Could you talk about breath a little bit?
Oh, that's my favorite subject. Early on, I come from a traditional yogic background, so pranayama, I did a lot of pranayama, and it was horrible for me. It was absolutely horrible because I would be by somebody else and I realized they could just sort of do something and I couldn't. So I've had breath challenges, which made me turn away from pranayama. And in the exploratory process of Feldenkrais, I learned how to, maybe one of the most important things for me to be able to go back to pranayama, which I've done, was to be able to differentiate breath from the movement of diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the thoracic diaphragm is the primary breathing muscle. And our breathing habits, literally from birth, are wired into how our diaphragm moves. And one of the one of the common ways that Feldenkrais works with breathing is to suspend the breath and to flutter the diaphragm, to move the diaphragm up and down, which allows you to mobilize the diaphragm while not taking in or releasing air. And that helps to untie some of those unhealthy patterns of breathing. So that was a big one, but also how Feldenkrais would help bring your awareness into the lungs, into the motion of the lungs, into the relationship of the lungs to the rib cage, into the motion of the rib cage and the parts of the lungs that move, the parts that doesn't, the difference between the left and the right side. And all of that allowed me to go back to pranayama and refine pranayama in the way that it worked for me, because pranayama in yoga is about regulating the breath primarily. And in Feldenkrais, it's about awareness of the breath and the restrictions in it and being able to untie those restrictions to be able to have a full, natural, easy breathing. And only under full, natural, easy breathing can somebody do pranayama effectively. Otherwise, they're simply going to lock in, usually, they're simply going to lock in unhealthy breathing patterns.
So pranayama sounds like for many people is going to be a kind of an advanced practice, and it wasn't really available to you initially, but by essentially playing with the breath through Feldenkrais, you were able to come back and really experience the benefits of pranayama. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to add one thing for, if people listening haven't tried Feldenkrais, this is one of the things that I noticed in my training, right away, is that often we'll be exploring a movement, let's say reaching the arm or something simple in a Feldenkrais lesson, and then it's kind of an inquiry. It's not even necessarily telling you what to do, but the question might come, did you do that while you were breathing in or while you breathing out? And of course, for many of us, it's like, well, which one was I supposed to do? And then, but often the question is just like, well, just notice which one you did. Now do it again. And if you were breathing out, now breathe in. If you were breathing in, now breathe out. And it's like you experience both of them. And then what did you notice felt better, as opposed to you ought to be exhaling as you do the movement or something like that. So that always struck me about the breath is how do you incorporate breath in your teaching now?
Well, boy, that's an interesting question, because I had a nasty disease process. And at the end of it, I was very weak. I realized that the yoga practice that I had been teaching for 20 some years was not helping me recover. So I sat down a la Feldenkrais thinking, and I thought, okay, what are the most restorative things I know from any system, not just Feldenkrais, but it was absolutely the Feldenkrais idea, Feldenkrais's idea that if you can't think of 6 different ways to do a movement, you haven't even started to think about, what that movement can do. So I sat down and I wrote out all of the things that I knew that were restorative. And I just put them all together, and I developed a yoga practice. And a piece of that is working with Kapalabhati Bhastrika hybrid. So do you know Kapalabhati and Bhastrika? They're two basic pranayamas. They have to do with a vigorous pumping in and out of the breath. One is more rhythmic, one is rhythmic in a different way. So I put those into a hybrid, and they are coupled with every movement that I do that I teach. So maybe more relevant to this is that the important thing is to make sure that breath is happening. As you were talking, it doesn't matter if you inhale on a movement or if you exhale. Ideally, you would want to be able to inhale on one movement and exhale on the same movement with equal ease. But our body and our nervous system and our mind and our brain will not learn and will not change unless the breath is present. And how subtly we can hold our breath, and how often we cannot pay attention to our breath. And so as a backdrop, maybe this is the more relevant thing for this conversation, that breath needs to be the backdrop of every movement. In whatever way the system that somebody is working with, it's appropriate. And to add the Feldenkrais perspective is that awareness is, what is the quality of the breath? There is the in and the out, but is it at ease? Is it participating in the movement?
Mm-hmm.
Because some yoga that I have done, the breath would almost be disconnected from the movement. Our body and breath is one continuum. It's not there's the breath and there's the body. Our body is a breathing mechanism. I don't like that word, but our body is a living continuum. That breath is a part of it. And so any asana, to be aware of breath, if the asana practice that somebody does not include the awareness of the breath, it can simply rest in a tiny way in the background. It doesn't have to be in the foreground. I like it in the foreground, but it doesn't have to be. It's just that breath needs to be present if we want to refine movements, if we want to make changes in whatever practice we're doing, which I assume most people want to make changes, which is we want to refine the asana. We want to refine the pranayama.
And that's another word that might be interesting to explore, asana, which I think most of us would translate in English as posture. I think that's the correct. But what is posture? Because Moshe Feldenkrais had a very different attitude about posture. I think for a lot of us, posture is kind of a position, and good or bad posture, a lot of our association is how it looks, kind of. But would you want to say more about the approach to posture in the two different practices?
Yeah, because that's one thing that I have explored actually a lot, because the Iyengar practice that I have been doing focused a lot on alignment. So that's posture, and your ears over your shoulders, over your hip joints, over your ankle joints. And that is really intelligent in some ways, because that is how ground force and gravity move through your body. But how that's done, because I went back and forth between, at one point, I didn't know whether I wanted to be a yoga teacher or I wanted to be a Feldenkrais practitioner, in terms of just which am I? I didn't want to be both. I wanted to be one. And I realized for me, yoga was a bigger system. It's been around for thousands of years. It had it. But I was also profoundly aware of the limitations in my experience of practice and in the teachers that I came to. So if you take that idea of posture and all of that alignment, if we are holding ourselves in that position, which is very common in yoga, you're going to lock things up. You are going to override underlying habits that are your habits, that are ancestral habits, that are very old, deep habits that are going to contradict that posture. Feldenkrais per se, I've never heard anybody who works, quote, with posture. They have that phrase, acture, the action with it. But if we take that alignment and we explore little tiny movements, okay, there's that alignment, posture. Okay, how is my head resting on my first cervical vertebra? Is it light? Is it able to move in any direction easily? So therefore, I can hold it in a position with ease. If I can't move it in a lot of different directions with ease, I'm not going to be able to hold it still in a way that my nervous system says, yes, okay. And so, just kind of extrapolating that, taking that down through the joints, we do not want to hold ourselves rigidly in a posture, but we can use those alignment principles to say, yes, absolutely, ankles, hip joints, shoulders, and inner ear level. To do that, ground force and gravity can move more easily through us. And I've always loved this. It's from Body and Mature Behavior.
One of Feldenkrais's books. right?
And this always struck me. He describes this experiment he did where at the feet of somebody, he put a machine that registered vibration coming through the body. At the head of somebody, he put a vibration creating instrument. And he tracked on the other end how much vibration came through the body. And in a well-organized body, there was much more vibration registered on below the feet. And I would say that if you took that body and you put it up into gravity, I am thinking you would have ears, shoulders, hip joints, and ankles. You know, so it's that idea, you want life energy. I don't think Feldenkrais liked that idea, but you know, that ground force and gravity goes through you, or vibration goes through you. In that kind of support, we have ease.
So as opposed to holding a posture, which is a phrase we often hear in the context of yoga, it's like a posture is kind of almost like a readiness to move out of the position if need be. I know there was, he said something at one point about good posture being the ability to move in any direction and not needing to prepare. Like if I have to go left, I can go left. If I have to go right. Yeah.
And that how you just described that, I would say would be like a perfect thing to take out of Feldenkrais and put into any asana, any asana practice. And that would require not all that, well, to just touch into that before starting any practice, you know, so that notion can inform it, or that,
So you're describing sort of like you can go into a yoga pose, but then inside the pose to begin to play within that shape, something like that?
Depending on the type of practice. If you are fully extended in an Iyengar type pose, there's not a lot of room for it. So I would, if you are working in a less extended pose, I think that experimentation is more easily accessible. And I'm not sure how many Iyengar people are actually interested in this, but I would hope they would be. But to maybe do that in the process of entering the pose. So you can go into the pose and you can explore these possibilities, or you can kind of enter into it a little more slowly. So the movement of the hips and the different possibilities of movement in the spine. So by the time you get to the end of the pose, you've got kind of a foundation of ease. It's harder to find ease when you're fully extending, when you're already fully extended. And it's much easier to find ease in the extension if you've paid a little attention in the process of entering it.
I'm wondering, maybe before we wrap up, if you could offer like just a little discussion of an asana, maybe one that you've noticed some of your students have difficulty with, and just kind of like what we were just talking about, but maybe with specifics like, I don't know, downward dog or something like that. But, you know, a couple suggestions for a yogi drawing on some of your Feldenkrais background, how they could play and possibly improve their experience.
Okay. Well, downward dog, certainly everybody knows downward dog.
Yeah.
You know, going back to that idea of peripheral, is by shifting in downward dog, and this would, you'd want the knees to be bent, which gives a little bit more space for movement in the spine, is to put the weight on the thumbs and press through and notice, how does that line, how does that feel? How does that line go through my back? And then do that individually with each finger and take time to sense, how does that track through? 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 So each of the fingers. And then, this part of the thumbs is where you usually get the maximum amount. But by enlivening all of the fingers on the hand, you're going to engage different parts of the arms. And then you can repeat that process with your toes. And shifting, and you can do this with kind of both hands together, both feet together, or you can shift over to one side and kind of explore that, particularly if you have asymmetries, that can be kind of useful to sense that on each side. And then if you come to the center of your body with the knees bent, you can take and shift the pelvis over to one side and lift, say, the right sit bone up. And you can take the left sit bone and lift that up and kind of go back and forth and roll the pubic bone back toward the tailbone and move the tailbone under. So you're getting movement in some of the directions of possibility with the pelvis. So then when you just sort of say, okay, now I'm going to be in that pose, you have awakened all of these different possibilities. And a la Feldenkrais thinking, your brain is going to help you to know which is the most efficient, effective, pleasantest way for your body to organize itself in downward dog.
I love that. And it's interesting to me too that when you explained, really thinking of the line through each of the fingers, you said it's likely that you're going to find the most efficiency in this area of the hand, but that's not a reason not to do all of the others. I think Feldenkrais said in one of his trainings something like, we do all of the mistakes on purpose. So rather than just saying that's a mistake and we're going to cut that out of experience and we don't want to do it wrong, we actually try all these variants. And then I imagine after the process you described, the person can do whatever their understanding of is the correct way to do it, but they've sort of woken up all of these other possibilities in the process.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun to just talk with you. I just wonder if you have, final thoughts on the relationship between Feldenkrais and yoga.
When I first started training with yoga or with Feldenkrais, one of the things that happened was I would go to a Feldenkrais training and I would leave it and I would say, oh, I'm too loose. Then I would go to an Iyengar training and I would come out and say, oh, I'm too tight. And I did that a lot before I was able to articulate it for myself. But that going between too loose and too tight, too loose and too tight is just that simple awareness. And that actually, I'm kind of a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, and that's one of their phraseologies too, around refining the use of our body and mind. So Feldenkrais is the most sophisticated way of getting in touch with the things that block our full capacity to develop ourselves in whatever way we want to develop it. So it is the foundation of my thinking about life, not just awesome, about my thinking about life. It is. And after all of these years, I am still so fascinated by what it can create and allow. And
Beautiful. Well, it was really wonderful to have this conversation with you. You have a website where people can find out more about you. We'll include that information below the video. And just for anyone watching this will land on YouTube. And if you want to see more of the things that we're producing about the Feldenkrais method and the monthly Sensibility magazine, which is also a newsletter you can subscribe to, stay tuned to this channel, subscribe and like the channel, and hope to see you again sometime soon. So once again, thanks so much, Faye, for being here.
Thank you, Seth.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.